Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I'm the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here, and it is my delight this morning to welcome Kate Ott, who is Associate Professor of Christian Social Ethics at Drew Theological School. She's an expert on the formation of moral communities with specializations in technology, youth and young adults, sexuality, pedagogy, and professional ethics. Her newest book is called Christian Ethics for a Digital Society and is the basis of our conversation today. She's also the author of Sex and Faith, Talking with Your Child from Birth to Adolescence. Professor Ott, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Reverend Thompson, thank you for inviting me. I have always enjoyed our collaboration, so I appreciate being back with you in conversation again. And I appreciate being back in this format. I know many of us would like to be seated in our church pews together, having these kinds of conversations. But luckily, thinking about digital technology ahead of all of this happening has given us an opportunity to experience our Christian faith and faith formation in new ways together that reflect on something I've been thinking about for a number of years now. So I'm grateful that the format itself embodies part of our conversation together today.
It's very fitting.
So I'm just going to start off with a sort of a short overview of my own approach and some of the issues that I address in the book to kick off conversation, and then hopefully it will go wherever folks are interested. So when I started this work, I was noticing, and I will say that much of my work in faith communities is around sexuality issues, and I work with parents and teens and children. And so you can imagine how questions of digital technology started coming up and what they intersected with. And that was actually the place where I felt a call to say, I've got to learn more about this in order to respond in a responsible manner to folks' questions. And it just led to thinking about digital technologies from all different aspects. But what I noticed in those conversations was three specific things. The first is that we are often not well informed about how digital technology works. And I think that leads to us being malformed around our moral response to digital technology. So that's to say we are technologically dependent, technologically immersed, but not necessarily technologically savvy. The second was that we overwhelmingly think of digital technology as tools, as devices, rather than seeing technology as a force that's interactive, that's meaning-making, that's social and human shaping of who we are in the world and how we form relationship. And then the third was that we often respond to technology with either panic or awe. And I think either end of that spectrum pulls us away from a really engaged, creative, moral response to what's going on with digital technology in our lives. So I wanted us to go deeper. And I sort of posed the primary question for the whole text, which was, what does God require of each of us to be and do in order to promote our Christian values related to engagement with digital technologies? And then I took very specific kinds of digital technologies in order to work that through in a couple of ways. Before I get to those sort of five primary approaches, let me say sort of my method was something that often happens in K through 12 educational materials, which is digital literacy. And then I brought to that our Christian traditions of critical pedagogy. So the traditions of sort of liberation theology and liberation pedagogy, thinking in a praxis method where we act and reflect and we learn through doing and we revise in that manner. So thinking about how digital literacies help us respond, I got to this point of creative moral response nurtured by socio-moral pedagogies. So my ethics approach is really a social ethics approach and thinking about social literacies. Since digital technology affects our actions, the meaning of those actions, the way we form social relationships, even sometimes how we think now, as well as our social identities in the world. So out of that sort of basic approach, I looked at four major ways that we're shaped by digital technologies. The first is algorithms. The second is impression management or digital selves in the world. The third is data valence, and sort of the interaction between the second and third is social surveillance that we do on each other. And the fourth was around ecological issues and environmental issues in digital technology. And then I brought that together to say, one of our primary ethical responses, once we learn all this, could be to become ethical hackers. So in terms of algorithms, I suggest we should expand diversity in response to what we know about algorithmic bias. And I use the narrative of the Tower of Babel there as a template for technological advance that failed due to erasing cultural differences. In terms of our digital selves, I talk about cultivating attunement as a moral response to impression management and the way in which we sort of conceive of a Trinitarian type of relational self and God that's digital, embodied, and spiritual. In terms of data valence and social surveillance, I think we need the Christian practice of metanoia, which attends to both interpersonal and social sin as we seek, more just communities with each other. And then when it comes to ecological issues, I think we really need practice at sensing and materializing the digital clouds and wireless streams around us so we see their direct impact on the earth, sometimes positive, but also could be very negative and detrimental. And the ways in which we need to be co-creators with God in taking care of our environment. And so if we become that digitally literate and responsible, I think we need to become hackers. And it's often a negative connotation to be a hacker. I get that. And some people are bad hackers, not bad hackers, but bad people hacking things. But hacking really is about programmers who find vulnerabilities and fix those vulnerabilities, create safer, stronger systems. And we need to be able to do that around issues of social and personal sin when it comes to digital technologies. So I'm trying to sort of scale up the concept of hacking with an ethical call to gain access to the ecosystem of digital technologies and define the vulnerabilities as the perpetuation of social inequalities and injustices that we need to patch, that we need to resolve. And so if you want to think about that in theological terms, it's sort of a swords into plowshares, but it's not swords. We're adapting and hacking. It's digital technologies in our lives. So that's a sort of very short, quick overview of a much longer book, but tells you a bit about my approach and the primary issues that I'm concerned with.
Great, thank you. And I encourage those of you who are watching who have questions to type them into the live chat on YouTube or to the comments on Facebook. You can also email them to me at pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson@stbarts.org. So I'm wondering, Professor Ott, how your thinking has changed on any of these issues, if at all, given what's happened in the past few months, that we were already a very digital society, but arguably we're even more of a digital society now, that so many people are meeting through Zoom, for instance. Has your perspective on any of these ethical issues shifted at all?
I'm not sure it's shifted as much as it's deepened. I do have a concern that I think our longing for offline embodied material interactions with people might cause a bit of a backlash to the initial, like, oh my gosh, this is great. These are ways we can stay connected with each other. So again, maybe pushing us back to that third response of like it's either good or it's bad, it's great or it's horrible. What I'm hoping is instead we deepen our response to it, right? We see the ways in which this is a great medium, right? We can be conversational. I can see your emotional facial responses to me, right? That's something that we couldn't do and we cannot do right now during this pandemic. But that also means we should be concerned about other issues, like how are we using these recordings? In what ways are we monitoring people's privacy? How I show up in Zoom this morning, shapes who I am in the world and how people know me. And that would happen if I was in person too. But because it's on Zoom, its affordances, its ability to be spread, to be networked is so much greater. And as long as this is great, that's a positive thing. If I trip up and say something horrible, that could be a very negative thing reputationally, right? And so as Christians, how do we approach that? How do we ask ourselves, where are my values and how am I bringing those values to my use of this technology and engagement with it?
Yeah, you talk a bit in your book about forgiveness and how do we bring forgiveness into a digital realm where everything often is there forever, and we're not inclined to offer forgiveness if we Google someone, and Google tells us certain things about them, we're going to hold that against them forever, and the technology encourages that.
And there's also tends to be a social movement of forgetting, right? Of saying, well, those are mistakes in the past, let's forget it. Mm-hmm. I don't think either is a helpful response, right? I don't think either actually comes from our Christian tradition. So I argue in the book for metanoia, right? Which is a changing, a shifting, right? So we have to hold people accountable who do bad things in the world, right? Who harm other people. They need to be held accountable. But we also need to recognize in holding them accountable that the harms that they have done usually evidence much larger social systems that are also problematic. So in the text, I give the example of someone like Ray Rice, right, who was caught on video battering his girlfriend, now his wife. And most people's response, including his employer, the NFL, was to say, sorry, done, terminated. There is no way you will come back from this, no matter what you do in the world. So yes, be held accountable in certain ways, and maybe losing your job is one of those ways. Maybe having to socially show that you have changed who you are and how you will live your life. Those are all important things, and we do those in community. But if we do those things and we're like, oof, good, now we don't have to worry about that, we forget that we have a culture that allows for violence against women. And instead, we should actually say to ourselves, how do we participate in this? Why did that video go viral? Why do so many people watch it? Right? What do they think when they watch it? How does it shape us? How does it shape our children? So metanoia requires we also think about the social landscape of sin and respond to that in a new way, which perhaps gives people a chance to be accountable and changed and work towards good as a community.
We were talking beforehand that I was very struck in the book by the ecological component. We think of digital technology as the obviously green option, and yet there are environmental impacts from the devices and how they're created, from the energy we use to work online. Can you talk a little bit about the ecological ethics surrounding tech issues?
Yeah, so I have never done a ton on ecological ethics. I mean, I think that I am a person who is committed to social ecological justice as well in my own life, but haven't really researched it before. So this was my first opportunity to really do that. And I entered with the same assumption, right? Digital technologies was going to help us save the planet. And once I started digging deeper and even looking at the way in which gender, racial, and geographic disparities play out in this, I was able to learn and see sort of the life cycle of digital technology and the way in which there are aspects of it that are very, very dirty in a sense in terms of green economies. So one of the things I suggest is, okay, so we've got all of these little black devices attached to us that run our lives, right? Our smartphones. And I invite people to materialize the phone. So all of the data that's stored there that goes up into the cloud, right? So that when I buy a new phone, I can have all my contacts, all my photos, everything right there, efficiency. Well, what is the material energy cost of that cloud? How much does it weigh out in the world? What does it take up? If I thought of my device and sort of all the ways it's connecting with other applications and servers, how do I materialize, see actually like those colors? And this comes from the tradition a long time ago when we were trying to get people to think about the carbon coming from their cars. carbon dioxide from car emissions. They decided to test car emissions because you can't see car emissions unless it's really cold. Then you see the smoke, right? So the materialization of it actually gets us as humans to see its impact on the earth in a new way. And those are related to us. It might also be who's laboring to get those minerals that we need, right? The rare earth minerals to run a cell phone. That's usually across the African continent, some Southeast Asian areas, even some in South America, and the degradation that does to the earth to harvest those minerals, not to mention the political practices around it, have a serious global impact that I think as Christians who just sort of pick up this device, especially in the United States, we need to think more critically about what goes into this device, and could I recognize that every time I pick it up to make myself more socially aware?
Sure. In terms of disparities, there's been a lot of talk about the digital divide, and the fact that it's one thing for classrooms to go virtual, but if you don't have internet access at home, it's really hard for you to have access to your homework or to the virtual classes, and just we all have different abilities to access the internet. Can you talk a bit about the sort of ethical ramifications of that conundrum?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things many people probably didn't pay attention to was the rural digital divide until the pandemic happened. I mean, for a while now, school systems in rural United States have been putting Wi-Fi networks on their buses, so students can do homework in transport to their home where they may not have good Wi-Fi. And now it's a pandemic and you're stuck in your home. And so they're parking buses outside of neighborhoods, both in some rural places, but also in some urban places. So I think there's the question of connectivity. That's a digital access issue, and there are those came up in sort of net neutrality debates in Congress over the last 3 or 4 years. But there's also just this primary question we're talking about today, which is digital literacy. Right? You can give every kid a computer. But what about how they use it? Do they know how to access what they're supposed to access? Do they have the ability to kind of engage those technologies in a critical way? Or are they just sort of following directions and not recognizing that, to be honest, half the United States or more uses free Google systems in their educational networks? So Google's got a lot of data on all of us right now, right? And yet it's a trade-off of access because those are free services. And most of our school systems, especially our poor school systems, cannot afford to have a private network, even a cloud network, right? That our children are doing their homework on. So I think for us, it's a matter of thinking through what are the trade-offs of that. And honestly, that we can't solve that necessarily on local levels. We really do need political movements to change those larger issues of disparity, access, and data collection. On local levels, I do think we could do things though. Like I'm a huge fan of churches being those spaces, right? I don't know, did congregations actually feel this call? Were we more concerned about getting our services live than we were about whether our congregants would be able to stay connected? Right? So once your service is live, that's great. But if half your congregation can't participate in it, what good does it do you? Right? So maybe our focus was a little bit too much in the middle of this, in the early days of the pandemic, how to recreate what we do instead of how do we recreate what we do in a public way, as opposed to how do we recreate the networked relational aspects of community that people come to church for. I mean, I'm sure we come to church for sermons and communion and things like that. Those are all good things. But really, at the end of the day, we come for community. And we come because it connects us. And so how is it churches could be a vehicle for that connection, maybe even working to reduce those disparities in the context they're in?
Sure. So I do encourage those of you who are watching to send in your questions to the YouTube live chat or Facebook comments. You can also email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. Professor Ott, are digital communities the same as in-person communities? And what do we kind of have to think through in terms of the communities we create digitally from an ethical, moral standpoint?
Yeah. So I will say they're different. Some people will say one's better than the other, and that's people's personal experiences. I think they're different, and they give us what tech folks call different affordances, right? So if I'm in person in a community, I have certain embodied affordances, right? I can hug someone if they want that. We can, the kind of, I guess video allows for a lot of the same similar like facial expressions, emotional interaction, but in face-to-face communities, that's heightened. So where some of that is different in digital communities, what's heightened in digital communities? Our ability to network beyond time and geography, right? We can be together even though I am miles and miles away from you right now. That's an affordance to our ability to connect. We could invite people from all over the world. Some people would be up in the middle of the night, but we could invite them from all over the world to be with us. So digital communities create a kind of networked way of being that we cannot replicate on the same scale in person. I would also argue they allow us a kind of playfulness, and this playfulness could be it could be morally harmful, but it can also be morally generative. So it's a playfulness with who I am and how I represent myself to other people, right? I'm gonna guess a lot of people have created like a Bitmoji or an avatar. I'm not an Apple person, so what's the Apple thing? Does anyone know? The like text. Anyway, on Apple, you can text someone and you can be like a rainbow unicorn or a panda bear, right? That's a digital representation of who we are, just like if I chose to wear sweatpants instead of a nice shirt and a suit today. So digital technologies give us the space to creatively play with who we are. And I think this is one of the places parents get a little nervous with teens and children's engagement, but it's actually exhibiting really high level ethical decision making, not that we always agree with, but they are making these really interesting choices. So I think those are two examples. And I guess with the networked one, I would also say, if done right, it allows us to expand the diversity of our networks that oftentimes, because of our direct geographic location, we can't. So we often live in fairly racially and economically segregated zones, right? In our towns, in our cities. Maybe in New York, y'all have more option there, but if you think about your friend groups or your church group, they're still fairly monolithic. So digital technology allows us to interact with folks across age, ethnicities, race, genders, and learn in a new way. But we have to bring, I think, a Christian value that diversity and inclusion is what we're seeking. Obviously, some people use those digital technologies for exactly the opposite.
Sure. Is it important to, obviously, in this situation, we don't have much choice but to have most of our social interaction be behind a screen. But in general, is it important to limit the ways in which technology mediates our connections? I know you've done a lot of work with youth and young adults. Last week, we had a forum with a parenting expert who's a parishioner, and we talked a little bit about screen time limits and how those are difficult to impose in this context. Any thoughts about I noticed on my own, my iPhone tracks how much time I spend on the screen, and it's skyrocketed during the pandemic. It was high before, and it's even higher now. Any thoughts on kind of our personal use of technology and limiting that, and from an ethical standpoint?
Well, I mean, I would say I think we always need a break at different points from our digital technology, and whether that's during the pandemic or during our, what's going to be whatever our new normal is. Because it does require different ways of thinking and interacting than when we're offline. To the question of what kinds of limits would we set? I guess this is where my approach is a little bit different, because I don't have a ton of faith in very specific rules when it comes to digital technology, because technology is changing so often that it's difficult to come up with one rule for all time. But for example, I think it really depends the quality of the kind of interaction we're having online, just like it would be offline. So if you're thinking about kids especially, right, and their use of digital technology, are they, maybe their screen time has doubled due to the pandemic, but has the various ways that they engage online, their social relationships, their learning, from school technologies. So maybe you spend 8 hours now instead of 4 online, or maybe you spend 15 instead of 6. But is there a diversity of ways you're interacting? Are you playing video games and socially chatting with your friends, building relationships, interacting? Are you, maybe entertaining yourself on TikTok, which I know happens a lot with my teens in my house. And then do you just get submerged into that, or do you actually interact with other people around that? So they come and show me it, right? We talk about it. They send it to a friend. How are they engaging online with regard to their schooling? That's sort of a one-directional push kind of learning atmosphere. So I'm not as concerned about the amount of time. I'm more concerned about the quality and what's happening in that interaction. And I think that's especially true now during the pandemic, because to say like, oh, you can only have 2 hours of screen time, you can't even stay connected to anyone with that. And perhaps it would make for very disgruntled children around your house,
Right.
Which I don't want to do. But I think about that for myself as well. If I've been on meetings all day with colleagues, which is fun and generative sometimes and boring and workload, what do I do in the evening? Do I Zoom with friends, or do I take a break from that, go outside, walk, have my brain do something different?
Sure. So someone mentions a recent poll which stated that 67% of Americans used to attend church services in person monthly, but only 36% envision feeling safe post-COVID-19. And they ask, how should churches respond?
That's a great question. My primary role is in a university, but I'm also the Christian education director at our church. And I think going forward, like university settings, we're actually going to have to find a hybrid way for people to interact together. And I think hybrid ways of interacting, melding online and offline communities, can be difficult if not, if not done carefully and thoughtfully, because you can have your in-person congregation, right? The 30 people who want to show up that your church will fit, socially distanced. And if you preach directly to them, then the folks at home are not getting that same connected feeling that perhaps you cultivated in an online stream only. So we're going to have to think about the ways in which both of those forms of media, in-person communication and online communication, can be leveraged to still allow for that kind of community together. And we have examples of that, right? I mean, most of the people I know on my social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, I know in person as well. I don't see them all the time, but I know them in person as well. And there's ways in which those two formats of interacting and engaging build and cultivate a relationship. There's also ways we could use them that, I could show up online and social media with a very different personality than I do offline. And then people would start to see the hypocrisy of who I am as the integrity of myself. So I think that's what we have to think about as congregations, how we're going to create hybrid spaces. And I'm actually working on an article. Let me just grab it. I think there are 2 great resources for this. One is called Networked Theology, and the other is the Digital Cathedral. And both are thinking through the ways in which we can create justice-seeking communities that meld on and offline engagements. So I think it's a new learning opportunity for our faith communities, which I'm really excited about.
And it seems to me that potentially the definition of the individual parish church is changing. One of the positive things that has happened because of this is people that were shut in before, I hear this from colleagues in several different communities, If they have digital access, they now feel connected in a way that they didn't before. They may have gotten a weekly or monthly or quarterly visit from someone, but that was the only connection to church they had. Now they can participate in worship every Sunday. They can participate in fellowship activities, etc. And we're also seeing that the parish church is not about just the folks who can physically gather in one space. Folks that may have moved away can join from Florida or from England or from around the world. So it offers some positive opportunities, but it's clearly a shifting landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend who now probably attends like 3 church services every Sunday.
I heard someone say 9 is
yeah. And 2 of them are in areas where this person usually travels to throughout the year. And one of them asked her to read the scripture, right? Which she never would have been able to do from literally across the world. So I think again, that's sort of the networked nature of digital technology that broadens our communities. And again, I guess the question for me is just, how do we not only broaden, but how do we deepen? How do we make sure that those are quality connections, and still, maybe pick up the phone and call the person who's shut in, rather than just relying on, well, now they can watch the service, so why do I have to go visit them? Or we need multiple forms of interaction. Again, this goes back to the digital literacy piece. Those various forms of interaction, of action, of doing, create different meanings, ways of thinking, ways of being. And so we need to mix them up in order to have kind of robust communities. I'd also say one of those books, The Digital Cathedral, part of Anderson's argument is that we in faith communities move to very closed congregational networks in person. And digital technology allows us to go, in his view, go back to some of the ways in which church, or his view, the cathedral, was a social location, right? It did social services. It engaged people in various forms of learning. It was politically active. So he uses kind of the old version of cathedral. We might even think about it as temple, right? Any of those kind of old forms. Some folks in digital ethics would say, no, that's not exactly a good replica of it. I've heard Shane Hipps in another work he does talks about the text about the leavening of yeast. And he uses that metaphor to think about networked communities and why we should get rid of the walls of our congregation, not physically because they'll fall down, but metaphorically, and integrate new ways of leavening the yeast to create community in congregations.
So one person asks if you have any concrete suggestions for connecting folks who are not connected digitally. Right now we can't necessarily go and visit someone in person, for example. Any suggestions about how to handle that? You mentioned picking up the phone and calling them is one of them. And we've been doing some of that, but what are other ways you can think of, or other approaches to take?
Yeah. So, the congregation I'm a part of, the deacons have been using the phone, right? They've been calling. So again, I don't want to, I think one way this could happen is that ministers who are already burnt out and have way too much to do are asked to do double that. And that's not going to help either, right? That's not a just community response from a congregation. But how can the community members get involved in a new way? So I think there's that, right? How do you engage other folks in making those calls? There's been a postcard campaign in our congregation. So writing literally letters, hard copy material letters to everyone and sending them out to keep the connection. I also think there are other forms of service that are concrete that can connect our community. So it could be folks who are in need. You can do a socially distant food drive and find the people in your congregation where you need to just go drop it off at the door for them. But it doesn't have to be people who have a monetary food need, right? Well, what about encouraging a bake-off that's socially distant? People, sanitize cleanly, bring in those items, and then those items go with a note from someone else in the congregation that perhaps someone who's shut in has never met before. So those are non-digital ways that are creating a networked way of being across a congregation and connecting people. In terms of the concrete though, like, do we want to get those folks digital connections? I think those are important conversations to ask as a congregation. Where do we want to invest? And maybe right now, we don't have the access to go in and put a router in someone's house. But can we think about a plan as we go forward to invest in that, to allow for that? And how do we look for the kinds of technologies that are very simple in terms of use for folks who have not been part of the digital ecosystem, so it's not overwhelming to them, right? Like, how do we get very perhaps small tablets that only have 2 or 3 softwares added on to them so that folks in our congregation could receive one of those as a gift, and they know at 10 o'clock if they open that application on Zoom or live stream or YouTube or whatever, right, that they're already subscribed and the interaction is going to come up for them. So I think those, anyway, I'm rambling now, but those are a couple of ideas that come to mind.
Yeah, there was also a question about church being a place where we can meet people we otherwise wouldn't encounter, and how can we foster that digitally. One of the things that's been interesting for us to see is every so often someone is joining a class or a social gathering that hasn't actually been to St. Bart's in person yet, and that's really exciting to see. But how can we encourage more of that? What potential does this digital medium have for fostering connections that aren't already made? It's one thing to bring people together that have already met in real life, but can we as a church digitally connect folks that haven't met yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a place where some of our old forms actually work great, right? Invite a friend. And it's probably a lower stake invitation to say, hey, log on with me. And then you need to, in the chat, be writing to that person. So glad to see you online here with us today, right? Just like you would if they showed up in person, you'd sit by them. So you have to find ways to interact. I do think for a lot of folks, especially I would say folks who have left the church, so people who might fall into spiritual but not religious, or who just are disinterested or have been harmed by the church, online engagement with churches is a very low stakes way, but you still need a personal connection. Just like anything else that's new that you come into. So maybe it's an event, it's a conversation like this, as opposed to a worship service, which could be off-putting to a new person who specifically wasn't going to church because they didn't like that aspect. Maybe it's an invitation to one of the concerts that the church is doing because they have interest in music. So again, I think it needs to be a combination of a variety of things offered by the church online, but also individual members of the church making invitations and inviting people. And then if you also have new people show up online that you have not met before, there need to be a couple of people assigned during those gatherings online to look for those people, to make a chat note to them, to follow up, to invite them to add their email so they can get more information about these things. So I think it's thinking about the avenues we already use offline, but translating them to the functionality of online spaces to increase that interaction.
That's a great commercial, actually. We are next week for Pentecost, we're having Invite a Friend to Church Sunday. And our forum actually will focus on digital evangelism with Stephanie Spellers. So that's a great segue to next week.
And I didn't even know that, folks.
I know. Nor did the person asking the question, I think. So we still have a few minutes. If you have a final question to ask Professor Ott, I encourage you to send it along now. You mentioned Google earlier, and this kind of conundrum where Google is giving out a lot of free tech, but then they also collect a lot of data on us. And big tech in general is huge, and even more so in the financial markets. They've been doing well in the past few months when the other companies haven't. And I'm curious from a Christian social ethics perspective, how these digital issues help you think about corporations and their role in our public life, especially these huge corporations.
Yeah, so I think that's probably the sort of the biggest, most difficult aspect of this to tackle, because there are ways that things like Google Facebook, Facebook owns Instagram, WhatsApp. There's ways in which sort of globally these major tech companies allow for access, allow for connection that otherwise we wouldn't have. And yet they're also, the price of that is our data. And I don't think we have a realistic understanding of the potential social impact or uses that kind of data might lead to. Obviously, it leads to making money, which is their primary concern. But what happens in other authoritarian kind of government systems, or even in our own government, when we decide to track people who are positive, or for COVID, those kinds of things? How do we balance our responsibilities, our risks and benefits of those? From my point of view, I think we need to do it on at least two levels. The first is we need to do it individually, like read the terms. I know it stinks and they're really long, but read them. Go in and check your privacy settings. Don't just give away your data for free. You can still use the services and uncheck all the boxes of giving it away for free. You might not optimize your search as well, but you can give that up. And then the other aspect is, I think we need to wake up and be politically involved around these issues. The fact that Mark Zuckerberg can go to Congress and basically baffle our political leadership because they don't have digital literacy, because they don't understand how the technology works, means their companies can go ahead and make tons of decisions because our political leaders don't even know how it's functioning. So requiring that of our political leaders and advocating on behalf of that, I think, is something we really need to do. And Europe does that better than we do. They have a lot more restrictions around privacy, but again, that's a risk-benefit calculation, but it's an example of another place that's doing this and thinking through it.
Sure. So we have a question about inclusivity and tech. A person who's actually blind and has been having trouble connecting with her home church, and partly found St. Bart's because it was easier to connect as someone with disabilities. And I know there's been a lot of talk about sort of closed captioning videos that are posted with closed captioning, et cetera. That was something I became aware of early on in this. Thoughts about how we can keep issues of inclusivity in mind as we engage digitally.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point. There have been a number of stories about ways in which folks who experience physical disabilities have had new access to communities digitally and online. But I think that what's been left out of that conversation has been various forms of sensory disabilities. So things like blindness, using closed captioning, or even folks who maybe are not totally blind, but have different visual impairments. There are all kinds of digital technologies that actually work to, say, increase size or translate visual interactions for folks, depth perception and things like that. From my perspective, the digital technologies themselves, I feel, are on this spectrum of inclusion when it comes to physical disabilities and honestly even some cognitive disabilities. For example, on the autism spectrum and folks' engagement with digital technologies. So I think the technologies themselves actually have those kinds of affordances. I think it's us as humans who are using them and creating them that are already predisposed to forget about communities who experience various forms of physical and mental and cognitive disabilities. So then we don't look for the ways in which the technology can be more inclusive. But those technologies exist. And honestly, some of them are built in, right? Like YouTube lets you close caption. How is it's human error that our communities are posting their videos and not allowing for that, because we're not recognizing folks in our midst who need that as part of our communities.
So we're coming close to the end of our time. I'm curious, last week a few weeks ago, we had Teresa Berger, who's doing work on virtual worship. And I had been surprised to learn leading up to that point that Claire of Assisi was the patron saint of television, because she had sort of a vision of a Eucharist that was happening far away, and that Isidore of Seville was the patron saint of the internet. I'm curious, what pieces of scripture, what figures in the Christian tradition have been helpful to you in thinking about digital issues?
Yeah. So, I mean, I already named the Tower of Babel. I think kind of how we think of the Tower of Babel as this like radical community of difference, and whether we use technologies to erase those differences or to expand them is a really important ethical question for us. And it seems in that narrative that God is on the side of difference, and perhaps we should follow that. I would also say, so there's a quote, I'm not sure whether it's well attributed to Francis of Assisi or not, that talks about evangelism, right? That share the gospel with all people, use words only when necessary. And to me, that suggests that it is our actions, it is how we do things that actually evidence our Christianity in the world. And so the example of being aware of folks' various abilities and disabilities across our congregation is an example of that, right? You can speak a good sermon, but if people can't hear it or then have it translated for them, what good does that do? So I really think from that sort of tradition of paying attention to what we do and how we do that through the various ecosystems of digital technology is really extremely important. I have a few others, but I know we're at time, so I'll leave you with those two.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Professor Ott. It's been a real joy to be back with you this morning. And thanks to all of you who are watching. I do encourage you to stick around and join us for worship on our Facebook, on our YouTube at 11 o'clock. And I think we'll actually start the stream a few minutes before. So I hope you'll join us for worship. Thanks for joining us. Great to see you.
Thanks, you as well. Much appreciated. And I'm glad to now be part of St. Bart's community in a new way.
Excellent.